Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dale Wolkenstein here with you from the LAFB Network. Today's show, of course, is being brought to you by Underdog Fantasy, AG1, Aura, Mint Mobile, and Rock Solid Sports Memorabilia. If this is your first time tuning into the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein, this will be a breath of fresh air episode for us on Chargers Unleashed because we are not going to be talking about the 2023 episode in this season. Instead, Dan and I are actually going to be forecasting what is going to be the 2024 offseason. Dan and I were talking about this offline as this idea goes. We knew what the cap situation for the Chargers was coming into this year, and we decided to kind of go position by position in this creative little type of way where we're going to break down each one, talk about the priorities for each one of them going into the offseason, what the Chargers can do, can't do, what the priority for a draft need, priority for a free agent signing is going to be, because this offseason is going to be challenging for the Chargers, regardless of if the Chargers make the playoffs or not, regardless of who the head coach is, regardless of who the GM is. They have a very big challenge ahead of them in 2024. And Dan and I said, screw it. Why not just kickstart it now and have some fun with this 2024 outlook? Dan, I know that you've been digging into this a little bit, and needless to say, as it relates to the secondary position, which is what we're going to be highlighting today, I guess if you were looking at it from like a tax bracket chart, there's a lot of red. The Chargers need to get back in the black in some scenario.
It's true. It's true. And I know this episode is for folks who are either already past the 2023 season and are ready to go on to 2024.
Who could that be?
Or for folks who are wanting to understand like why the cap situation is so important, why the cap exists. And also for draft junkies who are already looking ahead to the draft and what position the Chargers could go to in round 1, 2, 3, whatever, day 1, 2, 3. The Chargers are in a wild spot going into the 2024 season. And a lot of that is because of the quote unquote all-in last 2 years that they did, both roster wise and salary cap wise, which we'll discuss here in a second. In short, Chargers put all their chips in, at least during the offseason, to the tune of now being, what is the number, Jake? $45 million over the cap going into the 2024 season.
Second for next year in terms of bad spending. let's call it that much.
And so before they can even think about drafting anybody, re-signing anybody, going after free agents, before they can think of any of that, they've got to figure out how they can cut $45 million off of this roster. And so when we go through this, there are going to have to be decisions made before we can even discuss any of these positions. So every episode of this, we'll probably have to do a quick recap of $45 million over the cap. You have contracts like Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Keenan Allen, Eric Kendricks, Sebastian Joseph Day, Corey Linsley, Mike Williams. All of these guys are in the cut candidate pool to get them there. This isn't the conversation of who we're going to cut and all that jazz. This is the if, when they make those moves and they get themselves out of the situation, however they do it, what will each of these position groups look like from a roster construction perspective? So we've level set. Jake, you and I, we decided cornerbacks specifically, the corners are going to be where we start first. And
overall, the entire secondary, really.
We can go both ways, but the cornerback to start, that group is in tough shape. To set the stage on this, currently, 2023, Jake, they have two guys that aren't even playing, one of which isn't even on the team, who account for roughly $21 million of cap space on 2023. Michael Davis, J.C. Jackson, benched or traded. And With that, you're left with Asante Samuel Jr., 2.3 million. Jazir Taylor, 1 million. Dean Leonard, 1 million. 800K for AJ Uzodima. And then you've got guys like Saying Bassey, Matt Hankins, Chris Wilcox, all kind of making pretty low. Fast forward to 2024, Jake. The guys on the roster right now: Asante, Ja Taylor, Dean Leonard, and Uzodinma. And that's it. That's it. Those are the only 4 guys on the roster at the corner position. Plus the dead cap of $18.8 million for JC Jackson.
My God.
So, Jake, I ask you, where do they start?
It's really hard to decipher that, especially with as much dead cap as you're getting from the JC Jackson contract. In the macro sense of this, since Tom Telesco has been the GM, very few of the big name contracts outside of the homegrown talent that he has obviously signed 2 second contracts have rarely hit. If you wanted to highlight the secondary, you probably go back to Casey Hayward. Probably could arguably be Tom Telesco's best free agent signing that he's ever done in terms of what you got back in return for that.
Yeah, probably.
Dan, you said this. What was it? I can't remember if it was last week when we were first having this discussion or earlier this week. The last time that the Chargers invested a first round pick in a cornerback was Jason Verrett. That's been almost 10 years. That's been a long time.
This year will be a decade.
Yeah. And then you go back and you start to look at, okay, well, how else do they reinvest? Well, one of my favorites, Craig Mager, who was a 3rd round pick from the 2015 draft. You look at just even in the last couple years alone, you have Jazir Taylor, you have Dean Leonard that obviously got brought up. But outside of that, and maybe Alohi Gilman, Mark Webb, your secondary, obviously JT Woods, your secondary has not properly either been reinvested in or elevated on return value.
Basically, all of them have been day 3 picks,
right?
Other than Asante Samuel Jr. and JT Woods.
Yes, and then to highlight that, okay, you have other free agents that were brought in: Chris Harris, Bryce Callahan, ones that didn't stay very long or didn't get you the type of return that you were looking for. So it's been a long time since this team in general has gotten a good return for its corners. Now, you fast forward to 2024. Alohi Gilman's going to come up for contract. You're still going to have Asante Samuel Jr. under contract next year, but that's a decision, obviously, that will be made in 2025 as far as what will take place in that circumstance. Saying Bassey is up for next year, who, depending on his play, which has looked pretty good over the last couple of weeks, how are you going to address that? As Dan mentioned also, you have Hawkins on that list. So there's going to be a lot of retooling just in general, not just in 2024, but in 2025 as well. So I think you could go right off the top. Mike Davis. I think the writing is on the wall from the standpoint that he has now been benched these last 2 weeks. You take a look at that contract hit. I don't see a situation where he returns to the Chargers in 2024. You're still going to be eating that money from the JC Jackson contract. You start looking into the free agent pool as far as what's possibly available for the Chargers. And to be perfectly honest, it's not the best cornerback free agent group as it stands right now. Obviously, between now and March, a lot of things can change in that circumstance. But even still, because the Chargers have put themselves in such a hole financially, they're really not going to have the luxury to spend.
It won't even matter.
Yes. So,
which honestly, Jake, I will say that might actually not be a bad thing. And hear me out here. Like, I think you and I both have been frustrated with kind of the roster construction in the sense of like they've got a bunch of these like tier 1 players. And then after that, it kind of thins out real quick. Like, go look at the spot track for 2023 and you tell me how this looks. But what they haven't had is a lot of those like gel guys, the Kyle Van Noys of the world, like the Bryce Callahan types. Like they need more of those types. And obviously they need more of the draft picks to hit. So maybe because they don't have money, I don't know if this is me just looking at glass half full, but maybe because they have no money, maybe this will force them to look into that type of contract more and those type of players more. And so like when you look at the 2024 cornerback free agency pool, it's like, all right, well, scroll all the way down because the top 60% you don't even have a chance at. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe they go for low dollar amount, but high value. Like, look at the cornerback group right now, Jake. Like, Sang Bassey, Dean Leonard, Jazir Taylor, Asante Samuel Jr., all of them make less than $2.5 million, and most of them make far less than that. And that's your starting group. Yet you got currently JC Jackson for $11+ million cap hit, Mike Davis $9 million cap hit, not even on the field. So there's something about, like, if you hit a big contract, they got to play and they got to perform or else you're screwed. This team, I think, needs to have more of quality depth than star talent, because what we're seeing this year, Jake, and I don't think anybody can argue otherwise, just having star talent and star contracts isn't working. It doesn't work.
It's not enough. And I'm not sure if you caught the ringer piece that Benjamin Solak had written. I think it was like a week and a half ago. Yes.
So good.
Fantastic. He had highlighted that the Chargers were 31st in cash spent in 2021. Now, that was an offseason that we all knew. This was, of course, after Brandon Staley's first year as a head coach. We knew that they were going to spend money that year. That was not a surprise to anybody when they spent that much. You now have one of the highest payrolled defenses in the league. When they spent all that money, that brought them all the way up to 17th. And then, of course, because of the rollover in contracts, now they're up to, I think it's 8th in the top 10. So they jumped significantly in terms of cash spent, and a majority of that goes to the defense. But Dan, as you highlighted, you can't have that many free agent signings without having some return.
Or even just that many big dollar signings total that aren't on the field.
Right.
Like literally. Like Joey Bosa, not on the field. Big dollar. Like big dollars. Mike Williams, big dollars, not on the field. Mike Davis, big dollars, not on the field. Corey Linsley, like, you go on and on and on. You can blame all this kind of stuff and injuries suck and they're flukes and all that kind of stuff. But like, that's the risk you take if you are relying on a few guys to make your roster look good. If those few guys are gone, you're screwed.
So outside of, let's just say, Alohi Gilman, because we know his contract is up for next year, Dan, outside of him, from what you already know is still going to be part of the secondary unit, yes, next year, Asante Samuel Jr., Jazir Taylor, Dean Leonard. Is there anybody, and maybe just still time will tell on this, as far as who you could say moving forward with before we start talking about outside names, draft picks, what have you? So who would you say, as far as right now, at least rounds out the rest of that secondary group? You still have, obviously, JT Woods, that is technically under rookie contract. Yes.
So right now you've got 6 guys under contract for next season. 4 corners, 2 safeties. The 2 safeties, Derwin James and JT Woods. That doesn't feel great. And then corners, Asante, Ja Taylor, Dean Leonard, and Uzodinma. Okay, those are your 4 corners, 2 safeties. The guys that you can bring back, I think Alohi Gilman's probably, between Alohi Gilman and Gerald Everett, those are probably your 2 top priorities to bring back in terms of like the ones who would cost the most in theory. So Alohi Gilman, if we're looking at secondary specifically, Alohi Gilman, I think, is a big one. You could probably bring back Sang Bassey for pretty cheap. Jalen Hawkins, probably the same thing. Not touching a Michael Davis contract. They don't have money for that at all.
How about Raheem Lane?
And then you've got exclusive restricted free agent Raheem Lane. They can bring back on a very small contract, so that's a no-brainer. So I think Raheem Lane will be back. AJ Finley, restricted free agent, probably could bring him back. I know other teams would have a chance to match it, but who's going to match it? What does he put on tape that anyone's going to see? So you'll probably see Raheem Lane and AJ Finley as brought back. at least to the initial roster, not the 53, but the larger one. Honestly, if it could be Derwin, JT, Alohi, Raheem Lane, and AJ Finley, like if they could run that back, like that's not bad. That's not bad. And then the corner one is where it's tough though. Like you're not going to feel good even if you bring back a Saying Bassey, add him to the room of Jazir Taylor, Dean Leonard, AJ, and ASJ. Like you got no top end talent. Again, I'm saying top end talent, not top end contract. That's where Jake's head gets big when you start thinking about, okay, well, how do they fix this? Could they do it in free agency? You look at those, I don't want to say bottom feeder contracts, but the value contracts. So look at
that's really what they're going to have to deal with. Yeah. And you're not going to really find starters in that pool. It's mainly going to be for draft, or excuse me, for depth.
Well, the challenge the Chargers have is they're going to try to they kind of have to, and they're going to try to. Like, they're kind of in a situation where if they don't go corner in round 1 or 2 in the draft, they are going to be banking on either Asante Samuel Jr. and let's say a Saying Bassey or Jazir Taylor, Leonard. That's their starting group. Like no one feels confident about that. Like nobody. So they're either going to be banking on, which I don't think that's an option. So I think they're either going to be banking on them finding a free agent that they can hope hits for low budget, which I think they're probably going to do, not necessarily for starter, but they're going to try, or they can spend that money and invest it in a first round corner, which in my opinion should be priority 1. And I don't think it's any question. I can say mess around and go receiver. I can say go Brock Bowers. We'll talk about all those positions later. But if we're talking just solely roster construction and premium positions that this Chargers team is kind of dicey at, it's probably edge and it's probably corner. Those are the two that they're kind of stuck with having to most likely select in round 1.
As a side caveat, one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation, not just because of the big picture, because in reality, as Dan and I are going to highlight with each one of these positions, virtually every position, with the exception of cornerback, the Chargers are going to have to reload over the next 2 years, and it's not going to be easy. But one of the reasons that I wanted to do this was it kind of gave us the excuse to throw in some draft talk in December, which, of course, I'm always one for. Dan mentioned Brock Bowers there a second ago. Outside of cornerback, it would literally be Brock Bowers or corner for me. That's
no edge.
And based off the argument that you're saying right here, Dan, as far as what you're going to need, and we're talking like first round high pick priority here. Obviously, edge is going to have to be
20 probably.
Yeah, obviously, edge is going to have to be addressed at some point. But if you look directly into next year, as far as you look at what you got, what you're not going to have, as far as some of the weakest positions that are on your rosters in terms of obviously what has been devoid of talent and production for you in 2023. Yeah. And like we said, it's been a long time since the Chargers have invested a first round pick at corner. Derwin James was the last one that they invested in for the secondary in general that high.
2018, but that was like, 6 years ago?
Right. So you need to get back to hitting on some of these draft picks in terms of making them give you a nice return. So the good thing is for the Chargers is that even if they finish, let's say, in the top 18, which would not have them in the playoff contention, or for some magical reason they were able to get on a run and go beyond that, the good thing is that the top end of, or the first, there is a lot of good talent as it relates to the cornerback position. Alabama's got 2.
You think corner or safety or both?
I'm actually going to highlight both. So okay. Kool-Aid McKinstry, Terrion Arnold, 2 cornerbacks from Alabama, both physical, play press man coverage. Wouldn't mind seeing either one of them in a Chargers uniform, depending on where they're selecting. Nate Wiggins from Clemson, I know, is a favorite of a lot of people right now in terms of what he is able to do in the secondary.
I don't know what's on your list, but do you have the Iowa kid on your list?
I was just going to say Cooper DeJean, because he is like a chess piece. He could play safety. He could play corner. He could play linebacker. It's almost like having a slice of Derwin James out there right next to him in terms of his skill set and what he's able to do. You can literally use him anywhere. So
is he like Brian Branch? I haven't seen much of him, but is he like that kind of mold?
I mean, if you said what he did in college for Brian Branch, yes, obviously for how Detroit's playing him, they're playing him specifically at safety. I would put Cooper DeJean skill set a little bit more as like if you had a coach that utilized Cooper DeJean the way that the Chargers use Derwin James, put those two next to each other.
Like a Desmond King type.
Yeah, that's another comparison in terms of that. But obviously Cooper's a little bit bigger, so he could come into that linebacker spot if they needed him to. But that's just using it as examples. There's plenty of first round talent. And trust me when I say that these names that we're talking about are probably going to elevate over the next couple of months with the combine and ultimately when we get to the draft in April. So
Jake's Christmas.
Will the Chargers be in a position to get any one of these? The good thing is I think that they should. Any one of those four names, and again, I know we're talking early draft status here. We're not taking a huge deep dive into the draft, but those are just some names to remember as we get closer to April, and we'll be dissecting that a lot more between now and then. But Dan, I think if we're just talking about the macro sense of this conversation as it relates to the secondary, yeah, I think you're kind of forced from your price tag and your current cap situation that you're going to have to address this in the draft, and you have to do it high.
Yeah. I mean, like, look, we kind of briefly touched on the free agents that are available this coming year. Like you've got, top end, right? You've got guys like Adoree Jackson, Kendall Fuller, Stephon Gilmore, Kenny Moore, CJ Henderson. Like all these guys are going to be going for probably $8 million plus, aside from maybe CJ Henderson, maybe a little bit lower. Like you're going to have to scroll all the way down, Jake. I'm looking at the contracts that are like in the 3s or lower. Sean Bunting, Miles Bryant, Trey Herndon, Ronald Darby, maybe a Jalen Mills or below.
Again, we're saying these numbers because you can't just say, oh, let's spend whatever money that the Chargers have on a quarter. They're going to have to spread this money around because of the fact of who they have left to sign. And like I said, almost every single position, with the exception of quarterback, the Chargers are going to have to reload at.
Now, this is why, one of the reasons why I think the Chargers should go corner in round 1. Let's just say the Chargers end up drafting at the position they're at currently, which is 12th. Personally, I think it's probably going to be more like I'm going to guess it's going to be more like in the 16th, 17th, in that area. But let's say they do draft a corner in round 1. Current position, that corner 2024 cap hit is roughly 3.3 million. Compared to 3.3 million, that will go up a little bit as you go on year over year, but compare that number to a number like Mike Davis, JC Jackson. And I know that even those are very large differences, but $19 million cap hit in 2024 for JC Jackson versus a $3 million cap hit for arguably a player who should be at that caliber. As
know which way I would like to go, sir.
So again, this is where like that GM hat, and you question, and we've talked about this before, but like who's running the show here? Like, is this like a John Spanos, Tom Telesco decision? Has it been? How much pull does Brandon Staley have? Who would be the people that be making decisions next year? We don't know. Like, there's so many variables.
We don't even know who is going to be manning those positions next offseason.
Yes. So in my eyes, like they've got to invest in the secondary early, and especially given, and this is the part that, everybody talks about how important the trenches are, which like obviously, undoubtedly 100%. They are important, but how this league has changed into like the passing league that it is, a team that has not invested in a corner in a decade, like that's not smart. I know they swung big for JC Jackson. That's too risky if that's the only thing you're going after. Like, Derwin James was a hit, 2018 first round pick. That's what you get when you do first round picks. Sometimes they're busts.
When you also obviously also do them right.
Yes, but a bust first round draft pick, while not good, is way more salvageable than a bust top tier free agent contract. Like that's
Agreed.
crippling to a franchise.
Agreed.
So
yeah. I mean, I'm with you on the whole trenches standpoint, and I do think that the Chargers have to reload there. But thankfully for the Chargers, regardless of what you want to say about them now, you've essentially found 3 starting linemen for your offensive line in the last 2 years as far as the draft goes. So, not saying that that has to carry you, but in terms of you compare what you have as far as starters go now, what you've invested in over the past 2 years, now look at the secondary.
Totally. But the problem is Trey Pipkins regressed this year. You don't know what's going on with Corey Lindsley.
Yeah.
You're going to have to fix those at some point. Center's a big
issue
too.
This whole series of positional conversations is going to be a lot of fun. And trust me, when we get to the offensive line, it's going to be just as interesting.
Not to sound the alarm, but also to sound the alarm. Like legitimately, Jake, you kind of teased it earlier. This team has 9 positions they need to target in the draft or free agency that like they have to pick on. They need more edge position help. They need corner, obviously. Safety, we told you, there's 2 on the roster right now. Interior defensive line, there might not be Sebastian Joseph Day and Austin Johnson. Both those guys aren't going to be there. Linebacker, who knows they do with Eric Kendricks? If not him, it's just Deion Henley and Nick Neiman. That's it. Then you go to the offense. Your running back roster right now, Jake, for 2024, Isaiah Spiller, and that's all.
The running back conversation when we get to that position, Dan, is going to be extremely interesting.
Tight end.
Spoiler alert, you talk about investing in a position for a consecutive number of years and not being able to get anything out of it. That will essentially be the teaser for the running back conversation.
Yep. Tight end, Jake, 2024. The only one on the roster currently is Donald Parham Jr. So you need to get tight end. Center, the only one on your roster.
I think Stone Smart was on there as well.
I don't think he is.
Okay. I stand corrected.
Center, the only one on there is Corey Lindsley, which even that's a big variable. We don't know there. And then wide receiver, the ones there, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, Josh Palmer, Quentin Johnson, Darius Davis. The top 2 names, you don't even know if they'll be on a team next year. So we said this is an interesting year. That's why. Every position, it seems like, other than quarterback, they need it.
Isn't Easton Stick's contract up?
It is.
You're gonna need to get a backup quarterback.
Justin's the only one on the roster. Like, it is thin. It is thin. It's scary. So, like, I'm sounding the alarm, but when this whole conversation
it needs to be
bigger
sounded.
and bigger, like,
it needs to be sounded. And that's why I wanted to have a conversation like this early in the game, because it's going to be fun to break these down one by one. Just by the point when we get to the off season, when free agency actually starts, these hard decisions end up coming down, because trust me, the Chargers are going to have some tough decisions to make in terms of contracts that they're going to have to say goodbye to. We don't know which ones those are going to be yet, but they're going to have to make those decisions just in order to get themselves in a position where they can actually spend money. Hell, to even sign their own draft class, for crying out loud.
So I guess put your GM hat on, or your scouting, or whatever hats that you have on. Not necessarily specific people, but what's your, like, how do they fix this? How do they solve for the secondary for 2024? Like, what's your strategy? Like, and again, assuming that they do whatever they need to do to get under the cap, like, that's a given. So say they have, I'm just going to say, let's say they have $10 million to spend ish, which I think will probably be more like 15 to 20. But let's just say they have that number. That's for the entire team. How do you fix the cornerback group that is currently just, like I said, Asante, Jazeer Taylor, Dean Leonard, and AJ Uzodinma?
I mean, you can make an argument for any of those depth guys that have been forced to step up this year. You can make an argument for bringing them back. So you mentioned the Asang Bassi's, the Hawkins, the only corner. Yes, the AJ Finleys, yes.
I'm saying corner specifically. Are you bringing Asang Bassi back?
I would say if his play continues over these final 5 weeks of the season and what has been shown already these past 2 weeks, then I would say yes.
Okay, so that's 5 guys. That's corner. Okay. And then safety, are you bringing back AJ Finley or Raheem Lane? Raheem Lane, I think, is a no-brainer because that's cheap.
I would say yes. But obviously, your top priority as it relates to the secondary in general is you get Alohi Gilman under contract. I think his play has reflected that, and he has earned that second contract this year. So that would be number one.
Can you afford it? Can you afford it? Honestly, can you afford it versus going out and using that as like a second round draft pick or something? And I don't know. Like, that's what I'm asking.
It's going to be tough, but the Chargers are going to have to do that. I mean, just imagine this secondary unit if you don't. Dan, what are you going to do? Rely on JT Woods for next year?
Or a second round pick to be your starter, first round pick? I don't know. But yeah, that's my question.
Yeah. So I think you have to find some way to do that. And if that means not bringing back certain depth from a price tag standpoint, then hey, that might be what you have to do. And then you roll right back around and you reload it in the draft as far as building that up.
Who's more important to you then? Would it be bringing back Gerald Everett or bringing back Alohi Gilman?
I think it's Alohi Gilman at this point, honestly. I say that because, yeah, as you mentioned, Donald Parham is on the roster for next year, but you trust anybody at that safety position next to Derwin James right now? It's essentially Derwin and a plot of grass if you don't bring back Alohi Gilman. Yep. So if it was me and my GM was on, first priority would be, how do I make sure that I bring back Alohi Gilman on a second contract, and then I am investing heavy in the draft, top end for draft picks to reload that.
So December 6th, you're saying corner round one, that where you're taking your flag, or Brock Bowers?
Yeah, it's basically corner or Brock Bowers essentially for me right now. Yes.
Okay. The fact that we just did like 30 minutes and this is just the corner/safety group, like, you and I have talked about offline, but like Ed McGuire, like
I said, dude, he's going to have a big bottle of scotch on his desk trying to go through this whole contract situation this offseason. I do not envy his position.
Nope. Mm-mm.
The silence said everything right there. It's just like, take a moment of silence for all Chargers fans as we head into the 2024 offseason.
Yeah. So anything else from a secondary position or strategy that we go with? Like, is there anything else that needs to be said other than like, watch out?
Pretty much. I think how you're wrapping this conversation up, Dan, is literally how we're going to wrap up every other position that we're going to be talking about in this same type of.
Yeah. Bring back the depth guys, invest heavy in the draft. You're like, I only got one draft pick in the first round.
Right. But I think, obviously things will change position by position in terms of how you'd rank the investment and what's needed as it relates to the secondary unit. Obviously it's high, and you could make an argument that for these other positions are going to be just as high too. But the Chargers are going to have to be creative in how they do that. One is getting out of the cap space in order to sign back some players. Number two is maybe you have to acquire some additional draft picks to make it a little bit easier. I don't know. I heard some guy was clamoring for the last 4 or 5 years to trade back. I can't remember his name, but
I don't know his name. Rhymes with a Hank Schefter. Anything else, Jake, before we get out of here?
No, this conversation was fun. I'm looking forward to these. Dan and I are going to try to plug away at these once a week now. But yeah, in a weird type of way, it gets you prepared for the 2024 offseason. And obviously things will fluctuate between now and January, now and March, now and April. But as like a 50,000 foot overview of what the facts are in terms of what's going to have to be done in the offseason, this is going to be an interesting one for the secondary position.
Yes. This was fun. Looking forward to the next one. But until then, for Jake Hefner, Dan Wolkenstein, LA Football Network, and Chargers Unleashed, we'll talk to you next time on Chargers Unleashed.